Başka bir varlığın bilincini kavrayabilmek mümkün müdür?
Thank you very much for that question because it directly connects with the book I've just completed called Omnisubjectivity, which will be published by Oxford University Press later this year. And in that book, I argue that God has the property of omnisubjectivity, by which I mean the property of having a complete and perfect grasp of the subjective states of all beings who have such states from their own first-person perspective. So subjectivity is not just consciousness, but consciousness from the inside viewpoint. We all know that we can grasp other people's consciousness from an outside viewpoint. So I can know that you have an itch, but I might not, that does not mean that I know what the itch feels like to you, what it's like for you to have the itch. I can know that you're seeing a red bird outside your window, but I don't know what the sensation you're having when you look out your window is like. And I can know that you have a feeling of pain without knowing what your pain feels like. And what I argue is that God must not only know that you're seeing a red bird or that you have an itch or that you have a pain, but God must be able to know what those conscious states are like from your own point of view. God must know what they're like as well as you do. So God does not just have propositional knowledge that something is the case. God must be able to penetrate the consciousness, the subjective states of every being, every creature who has such states. And I argue that there are a number of reasons why God must be omnisubjective. First of all, it's entailed by omniscience. If God knows everything, God must know your subjective states as well as you do. It's entailed by omnipresence. If God is everywhere, God must be in your mind as well as in every part of a non-mental part of his creation, as in every physical as well as non-physical part of his creation. I also think that omnisubjectivity is implied by common practices of prayer. There's nothing about prayer that requires that God would not hear us unless we spoke out loud. We think that if we are thinking about God or having images of God, God is aware of that. God is aware of what is going on in our minds when we pray. And I also think that omnisubjectivity is implied by perfect love and perfect justice. So I'm assuming that to love someone perfectly, one must know them perfectly. So God knows exactly what it is like to be you and exactly what it is like to be me in order to love us exactly the way we are, to love us perfectly. And the same point applies to justice. To judge us perfectly implies that God knows perfectly everything about us that would be judged, every thought, motive, desire, choice, everything in our consciousness. So I think God should be omnisubjective. It's required, implied by the way we think of God in the monotheistic religions. But a harder question is, how can God be omnisubjective? So it seems like God would have to be in your head to grasp what's going on in your mind. But usually we think of our mind as our own private space. Nobody else can inhabit your mind but you. Nobody but you can be in your mind. If anybody else was in your mind, that person would be you. And some people think that for God to perfectly grasp what's going on in our mind, we would have to be a pantheist or a panentheist and think that we're part of God. And I argue that we don't actually need to be a panentheist or pantheist to believe that God can grasp our own conscious states. So I use a model of empathy to get to have a way of thinking about omnisubjectivity that's refers to experiences we've all had. And I think that we frequently experience empathy when we take on in our imagination the feeling of another person, and we can do that by taking on in our imagination their thoughts and their choices. And we do that all the time when we're watching a movie or reading a novel. When we do that, we don't actually have the character's thoughts and sensations and feelings and choices. We don't actually do as ourselves what the character does in their minds, but we can grasp what it is like for them to go through all of that in our imagination. Now, human imagination, it requires that we construct another person's conscious states by reference to our own past experience. So, if you tell me you have an earache, I can imaginatively project myself into your state of having an earache by remembering what it was like for me to have an earache, and then imagining that you're in that state. So my imagination and all human imaginations require, depending on past experience, that is similar to what another person is going through in order to grasp what's going on in their consciousness and their subjective states. But I don't think that we need to say that about God. You and I cannot imagine being in a state we've never been in. And I think that's probably why it's difficult for young people to understand novels where there's complex emotions in the novel. They don't relate to it because they've never had that experience. So we need to depend upon both our memories of past experience and we need to have had the appropriate experience to imagine what it is like to have that experience. But I don't think God has to do that. And I think that's because if we think of God as the first cause of everything that exists and the conserver of everything that goes on in existence, that means that God has to be aware of what he's conserving in existence. So God isn't aware of your conscious states by somehow remembering what it was like for him to have that state. God doesn't do that. You are in that state because God is the ultimate cause, the first cause of it, and the conserver of it. If God stopped being aware of your feeling, of your itch, or your sensation of red, or your pain, if God stopped being aware of it, it would go out of existence. So God's imagination of your feeling is something that is not the same, does not depend upon God's past experience, and it isn't just a copy of experience. So think about what David Hume said about the connection between imagination and sensations, or what he called perceptions. You can, according to Hume, imagination is a faint copy of an original experience. So our imaginations are weak. So according to Hume, when if I say to you right now, imagine a red bird, you can do that. And what you're imagining is a faint copy of a perception of a red bird. The imagination is weaker than the perception would be. And that might tempt people to think that if your imagination was perfect, if you perfectly imagined a red bird, you would be seeing a red bird because the imagination would not be a faint copy. It would be just as good as the original sensation. So that makes it look like if you think that God's psychology is like ours, it looks like God's imagination of our conscious states is the same as actually having our states. But I think that even when it applies to human beings, it's unlikely that Hume's empiricist view is correct. But even if it is correct for human beings, I see no reason at all to think that God cannot imagine without having actual, or 2 points here. One, it would be a mistake to think God can't imagine your conscious state without having had one like it himself. And it's also a mistake to think that when God perfectly imagines your fear, God's afraid, as if the imagination is the same as actually feeling it. Now, Aquinas argued that when we speak of God, we use our terms in an analogous way to the way we use them for human beings. And what he meant by that is that conscious or faculties we have, like the intellect, are analogous to the divine intellect. So the divine intellect is infinitely greater than the human intellect. So when we try to imagine what God's intellect is like, we think of it as an infinitely greater faculty that's like our intellect, only much, infinitely greater. And I want to say the same thing about the imagination. I think that the divine imagination has not been discussed very often. It does not get the attention of the divine intellect. I think that that's a problem, because I think that God does have an imagination, and that God's imagination is infinitely greater than the human imagination. So God doesn't have to do what we do because of our finite nature. God can imagine what it's like for you to feel fear, to be unhappy, to see red, and all the conscious states you have, because those states ultimately came out of God's imagination. So my view, the view I'm proposing about God's imagination is that God's imagination actually is his ultimate creative faculty. So I think of it like this. God had in his imagination, prior to the creation, all possible creatures and all possible conscious states of all those creatures. And then God chose certain ones to create, so that everything in existence other than God himself comes out of the divine imagination. And the divine imagination not only creates it, but keeps it going in existence. And so God does not have to inspect our minds to see what they're like. God knows what our minds are like because they came out of his own imagination. So the answer to your question, could you say the question again, just so we can make sure we're talking about the same thing?
Sure. Is it possible to grasp the consciousness of another being?
Right. So my answer is, the answer to that question, if it's applied to God, is yes, certainly, because of what I've been saying. If you want to apply that question to human beings, then I think the answer is yes, we can, up to a point, grasp the conscious states of other beings, but we don't do a perfect job of it, because we have to grasp other people's conscious states by remembering states that we've had ourselves that are similar. And not only is our imagination not perfect, but our memory isn't perfect either. And so I think we can do it up to a point, but we do it in a way that I think is closest to what we mean by human empathy, where, you tell me what you're going through, and what you're going through involves experiences, thoughts, feelings, and maybe some expectations for the future, choices you're making. You describe all that to me, and then I imagine what it would be like to be you going through that. But of course, I don't really know what it's like to be you, because I don't know your past life. And again, as I said, I have to rely on my past experience to try and represent in my own mind what it's like for you to go through the experiences, the conscious states you're going through. So in answer to your question, if we're referring to God, the answer is yes, and God can do it perfectly. And if the question is applied to human beings, the answer is yes, but we don't do a perfect job of it. But it's something like what we do when we talk to a good friend about what they're going through, or watching a movie. So
yeah, thank you. Yeah, it was really insightful. Yeah, like I always like think about some of the like consciousness questions. Like I know like it's similar to like Thomas Nagel's article, like how it's like to be a bat.
To be a bat, right?
But like I never thought of it as a like from a God point, like God's imagination point.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, it's a really insightful thinking in those
Thank you.
questions as well. Yeah, I really appreciate it. Yeah, it's really great to have you in our channel. Thank you for your answer.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Yeah, like that's all like okay for us. That's
Okay.
that's all.
All right.
Yeah, we will keep you posted after we process
Okay.
the video, and we will let you know.
Okay, thank you so much.